Gareth Southgate to Manchester United. What a perplexing and interesting question. And hey, that's what we're here to discuss today. But before we do that, let's quickly hear from David Ornstein about the latest news.
Well, Ineos have massive respect for Gareth Southgate. They know him well and appreciate his qualities as a person and manager. That doesn't automatically mean they're looking to appoint him at Man United, though, should a vacancy arise. His focus for now is firmly on the Euros, while United are yet to make a decision on Erik ten Hag. If they do part ways, I'm sure Southgate would be among the names in the frame, but right now that isn't the case, and as far as I know, he's not one of the leading contenders on this occasion.
Thank you, David. Well, now, it's an interesting idea, as I said, a hard one. We're going to discuss it today, and I don't know the answer, which is why I'm joined by John McKenzie, JJ Bull, and Jack Pitt-Brooke to have a think about it. Well, listen, Gareth Southgate to Manchester United, it sounds like a wild idea. Is it a bad one, though? Hard to know. JJ Bull, why would they be looking at him?
Well, I think there are a few reasons they'd be looking at Gareth Southgate, but one of the main actual ones they'd be looking at him is because he detoxified the England national team, if you recall. Mm-hmm. He reconnected the fans with the players. He basically made it acceptable for non-England fans to kind of like them, which was a hard thing to do. If you go back to 2016, what you have is Sam Allardyce is in charge, but he had to leave his post because he was caught using his position inappropriately for financial gain and agreed to leave. And that was after Roy Hodgson he'd left the position because he'd been humiliated along with the team after losing to Iceland in the Euros. England were bad, the England fans were not happy, this was what the team looked like, this is the England team you had at the time.
It was rock bottom, wasn't it?
The important thing is you had Wayne Rooney in here in midfield. This midfield is not amazing, I mean it's fine, this is a very mid team, this is a solid 80 or 81 on FIFA. You know, it's not great. But in came Gareth Southgate as the interim in September 2016, and then he made another reason that Man United would be looking for him is he made strong, clear decisions, and he stuck to those principles, which is important. One of the earliest things he did in his job as England manager was to drop Wayne Rooney from the England team. Now he was the captain and he dropped him. He didn't just drop Wayne Rooney, he retired him. Because soon after, Wayne Rooney announced his retirement from international football. So Gareth Southgate, first thing he does is come in and then retires England's all-time top scorer, which is kind of, he's not messing about. And there's players who come out with quotes, like Danny Rose said, "I definitely didn't expect the manager to drop him against Slovenia, and as soon as we all saw that, we knew that the gaffer was not somebody to be messed around with. He set his standards." And I think that's something when players and fans suddenly knew that he wasn't going to mess around. Would you say that's fair, Jack?
Yeah, definitely. I think Gareth Southgate had to prove that he had that ruthless side at the start because the narrative around him when he got the job was he was just a company man, he's just a kind of FA blazer type person. But I think that the stance that he took on Rooney and a few other players from that kind of what you might call late 80s generation, so Joe Hart again was kind of sidelined fairly briskly at the start of the Southgate tenure. I think that kind of set the tone and made players realise that in fact there were going to be some pretty big changes.
So players and fans suddenly knew that everything was actually going to change, and Southgate kept referencing the culture and especially Eddie Jones's England rugby team who were actually good back in the day. And trying to change the culture basically within England. And then Southgate was made permanent, or he's made the permanent manager, I should say, because he was real before then.
He was permanent already.
He was already there,
Well, we're all, in the sense, we're all temporary.
In a way. That's true, actually. Other big decisions which were very relevant, I think, is that he encouraged players to socialise. So under Capello, they were basically kept in rooms, not like a prison, but they weren't allowed to socialise really or be themselves. And he granted enormous access to the press. Would you have experienced that?
I did experience this.
What did they do with it?
In Repino, which is where England's base was, just kind of just north of St. Petersburg, so near the border between Russia and Finland, where England were based for the 2018 World Cup, and they had a much more inclusive and open relationship with the media. So they'd make more players available. The players were encouraged to be chatty and open and honest rather than very guarded, which they were during Euro 2016. We played darts. Not me personally. Oh. I was actually meant to play...
When you say we played darts, it makes it sound like
the press pack. So one member of the press pack each day would play against an England player at darts.
But you didn't get the call?
I didn't get the call. I did get the call. I got the call. I was going to play against... I've never told anyone this. I was going to play against Bukayo Saka during Qatar, and then it got cancelled for some kind of scheduling reason.
He found out it was you.
He was terrified of my 100 plus average. But no, that never happened. But it was just a kind of symbol of a slightly warmer relationship between the media and the England squad, which had been very frosty certainly in 2016.
Something which probably would be quite useful for Manchester United to have. So again, another reason that you'd look at Gareth Southgate if you're the Man United hierarchy. But tactically, he changed things at England as well. So we'll address all the off-pitch stuff. They changed how they played on the pitch as well to make them more quite boring, but they were better at winning tournaments because they underperformed in all the tournaments, basically, I would say. And World Cup 2018 qualifying, they were mostly a 4-3-3 or like a 4-2-3-1 kind of general thing. But for the World Cup, changed to this sort of shape that people have associated with England for a long time now, which is 3-5-2. It means you're very solid defensively, but what you get is say like these deep runs from players like Lingard and Dele who can run in behind, and then one of these can drop in. So they might work a move where you get the ball from Henderson wide to Trippier, who just hit it in behind. And there's loads of chances created in this way. We're doing this. When I say loads of chances, I mean very few, because actually the way that England scored and created all their goals was from corners and free kicks and penalties. That was it. And that's kind of what they wanted to do, because Southgate looked at how England needed to play in tournaments and how you win a tournament, and the best way is probably to not concede goals and just try and score from set pieces.
They did a lot of study of other teams who've been successful in recent years. They looked at Germany 2014, they looked at the France team who they looked at Portugal 2016, teams who maybe didn't play the most expansive football, but who had a fantastic record in terms of clean sheets. And they thought, like, here are the things that you need to win an international tournament, and clean sheets is so high up the list. And so a lot of what England have done, it's kind of starting from scratch, but it's also starting from scratch with the benefit of knowledge of, learning from other countries.
And now what you have is that they've changed it again to be slightly more attacking, you could say, but it's because, and I would argue, that they just have better players now. You have players like Declan Rice, you've got Walker, Stones, Maguire, they're all right there. But you've got Bellingham, one of the best players in the entire world. Foden's one of the best players in the entire world. You've got better players, therefore you want to push them a bit further forward by keeping that defensive solidity. And so they can play a bit more expansive, but you probably see them in tournaments still being quite defensive. But exactly what Jack's saying, they just analyse everything to death to work out what the most effective and efficient way to win things is. But the problem with the way that he plays with his teams in international football, and applicable to Man United, is that international football and tournaments are completely different to domestic football and how you play there. And so it's really difficult to work out what you'd be able to do at a club like Man United or anyone.
It is. I mean, you've kind of alluded to this already, Jack, but how is it different?
Number one thing is time with the players. If you're an international manager, you're only getting, a week here, a week there with the players. And so it's almost impossible to coach into them the kind of complex attacking patterns that characterise the club game at the top level. Whereas if you're managing an elite club, you've got so much time just to teach the players these specific moves. And that, I think, is, the other thing which is incredibly obvious is you can't buy players. So you're obviously very limited in your player pool if you're an international manager. And that, I think, is the nub of why international football just looks so different from club football. And that means that you have to rely more on set pieces, or you have to, you're not going to be able to pass your way through teams in quite the same coordinated, synchronized way that club teams can.
JJ, the nature of it being a tournament knockout as well, instead of a league, that changes the way that changes what teams are hoping to get out of every game, right?
Well, yeah, as you said yesterday, John, was that it's about not conceding rather than trying to score. Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think in a knockout tournament, you can get through a knockout tournament largely by drawing a lot of games and then winning penalty shootouts. So that changes the dynamics, I think, compared to in a domestic league where more often than not we've seen the title race that's unfolding as we speak. And that's been one where both Arsenal and Man City have had to win every game. And if they drop points there, then they're out. So having to win, not being able to draw, it means it changes the dynamic completely.
With that in mind then, would you say that Gareth Southgate, hypothetical appointment to Manchester United, might be a concern from a tactical point of view?
Yeah, well, I think that it's very clear from what is being said that the real upside you get from someone like Gareth Southgate is that they are able to do a lot of the root and branch stuff. So tear out infrastructural problems, sort out toxicity, try and get everyone feeling a bit more positive about the club, which is why Manchester United would be thinking about bringing someone like him in.
Are you saying people don't feel positively about the club?
Yeah, I think there's an argument to be made that that's been the case over the last few years. But what I think is really important to remember is that, yes, on the one hand, when people talk about Southgate, they're often quite dismissive of his tactical aspects, and we can talk about that a little bit more. But I think it's important to remember that a good elite football club has to have everything sorted out. I mean, part of the reason why Arsenal are where they are now is because they sorted out the culture. Arteta sorted out the culture at the club, and that has allowed them to be much more positive. But we have to have a holistic view about all of the areas of the pitch. If Arteta wasn't so good from a tactical point of view, Arsenal wouldn't be challenging at the top of the table. So it wouldn't matter whether or not the culture was sorted out if the tactics aren't good enough. So I've just got a graphic here to show that. So this is very reductive, obviously, just 4 different areas of
I liked it.
Yeah, with 4 different areas of a football club where, and everything, as you can see, impacts everything else. So when we're talking about tactics, you can only play the tactics that you can if the squad is able to play those tactics, etc. If your infrastructure isn't good enough, maybe your recruitment isn't good enough to get the squad that you want, to play the tactics that you want, and all of these things bleed into one another. So if the tactics aren't good enough at Manchester United, if Manchester United aren't able to challenge at the top of the league, then it doesn't matter how good your culture is, because there'll still be a feeling that the club isn't performing at the level to which it's performing.
And I think the strongest part of the argument here is that Gareth Southgate, as JJ said at the beginning, he detoxified England, he completely changed the culture, he made it a very exciting and happy thing for many people, but he was allowed the time to do that because they were winning. And I think if he was, I'm sure I believe he could probably achieve the same results at Manchester United. I'm not sure that he could win enough games at the beginning in order to be given the time to do that.
Well, the influence of Dan Ashworth there is important because he was in place before Southgate came in, right? So they worked together on things like England DNA and changing that whole culture aspect of it.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about Dan Ashworth in full later. I don't know if it's in full, but we're going to talk about it in more.
Complete life and times.
Yeah, exactly. The biography.
First of a 20-part TIFO series.
A 20-part volume of books.
We're going to create a man from the DNA, like in Jurassic Park.
Yeah.
But spliced with a frog, like they do in Jurassic Park.
And like in Jurassic Park, John, it's all holistic, isn't it? That's what you're saying.
Yeah, so the tactics are important. And the big question, as we've said, is how much does Gareth Southgate have to win in order to be able to affect all of these other changes elsewhere at the club? I think that's a really interesting question, because I think what we've seen from Erik ten Hag is that in many respects his football is effective when it comes to knockout tournaments. They've won the Carabao Cup, they've got to both FA Cup finals in his time at the club. So it's clear that what the fans and the board expect from him isn't just simply getting to knockout finals. What is expected of the Manchester United manager is that they are able to challenge in the league. So the question is, what does a manager have to do in order for his club to be able to challenge in the league? And I think that obviously the gold standard here is Pep Guardiola and then Mikel Arteta now following after him. And what I think those two managers are excellent at is being able to dominate. That's a word that Arteta likes to use, but dominate in every phase of play and have the flexibility to move between different phases of play depending on what the opposition throw at them. So what I've done is I've thrown all of these basic ideas of how you might want to play in a game, in and out of possession. And if we look at all of these ideas, we can say Manchester City, Arsenal, they're able to dominate in these areas. Build up, they're able to do that. They're able to progress the ball down the field. They're able to squeeze the opposition into a low block and then break down that low block. They're able to transition well as well, which is something that we don't often talk about with elite teams, but they can do it super well. And then, attacking set pieces. So every area of the game, they're able to dominate whoever they come up against, makes them super dangerous. Same out of possession as well. So not only are they expected to be able to, press high up the field, but they're expected to be able to counter-press, mid-block, just every aspect of what we're talking about here. Arsenal and Man City are able to do that super well. If we then apply this to where Manchester United are,
oh God,
what are the areas where they're actually able to dominate? Well, in the last 10 years, I'd say in terms of attacking, they're definitely a transition team. And Erik ten Hag has come out and said he wants to make his team the best transition team in the world. But in other areas, they've probably not really stacked up. And Erik ten Hag came in and tried to work on the build-up, tried to work on the ball progression, and it hasn't really worked out. And so what he's done then, I would say, is that he's tried to find more upside in the out of possession area. So in the past, I would say, again, Manchester United have been pretty good at the defend your goal, so sit deep, win the ball back and transition and counter-attack. But in some of these other areas, they've been a little bit lacking. So with Ten Hag, we've seen the high press become much more important for him, because I guess the idea is if he can't consistently build up and progress the ball, then another way you can generate chances is by winning the ball high up, getting these high regains and scoring from there. So he's definitely leaned into the high press, particularly this season, with mixed results, and the counter press there as well. Also rest defence, I think there's been some interesting ideas that he's brought along with him as well. But the problem is that they're not able to dominate in every single area of the game, in every single phase of the game. So the big question is, how do Manchester United get to a point where they're able to do this? Because that's what you need to do in order to challenge at the top of the table. And there will be some people who will say to me, well, what about Real Madrid? Because Real Madrid, we're talking about the best transition side in the world. Can Manchester United win the Premier League by being the best transition side of the world? I think probably not in the Premier League. But Real Madrid are the actual best transition side in the world, and they are about to win the league. But I think it's worth saying that with Real Madrid, actually, if you look at what's happened this season, they've won largely because Barcelona have dropped off. And also, if you look through Ancelotti's career in terms of domestic leagues, he actually has fairly poor return on investment there. I think he's won 6 out of something like 23.
He's finished second a couple of times as well, though.
Yeah, so...
Just 6.
So, well, in terms of wins, right? And
Got to defend Ancelotti.
If you compare that to someone like Pep, it's the other way around, where he's barely lost any leagues that he's competed in.
Yeah.
So again, we're talking about different styles for different formats, as we're talking about with the international game. But I think it's pretty clear that in the Premier League, for Manchester United to challenge, they would have to sort some of these ideas out.
And is the problem then, and maybe you'd be able to speak to this as well, Jack, is the problem that we don't know whether Gareth Southgate can do that or not, because what he's currently doing with the England team is an attempt to achieve a different sort of goal anyway. So we don't see the evidence of it on a day-to-day basis, but we kind of wouldn't even if it was there.
Completely. Like, international football and club football are so different now. They've got more and more different, I think, over the last 10 years. And so we just don't have the evidence base really to know what Southgate would be like as Man United manager. Like, he hasn't been a club manager since he got sacked by Middlesbrough in 2009. And so there's certainly sides of the job that I think he'd be amazing at, like the kind of cultural reset, the kind of changing the whole narrative around the club, that sense of, you know, being a sort of positive public face for the whole institution. But what he'd be like in terms of, you know, trying to manage a team through a 60-game season, or the tactical demands of Premier League football, or balancing European football and Champions League, or balancing Premier League and European football, we've got no idea.
Yeah.
Like, we literally just don't know how he would react in those circumstances. And so maybe the answer is, we'd have to get a backroom team around him who know the league. But it's just very difficult to say.
I mean, if you were to hypothetically guess how he'd set up a Man United team, it would probably look like this, because it's the most likely scenario with the squad that we expect them to have next season, which is the same as everyone else. So the only real difference you're going to get, like, it makes sense to play them in transition over the top because you've got 3 fast strikers. You've got Fernandes who likes to ping the ball forward. That's the best thing to do. The difference that you might get with different coaches, someone like Southgate, is you might get better individual coaching and the development of players like Kobbie Mainoo, like who've come through. You might get that he can form a cohesive structure that allows some of these players like Rashford or Mainoo to flourish in.
Yeah, well, it's funny you mention Kobbie Mainoo, because Alex Barker for us has taken a look at the question of whether Kobbie Mainoo could start for England during the Euros. Take it away, Alex.
Kobbie Mainoo has been Manchester United's breakout star this season. So, should he start for England at this summer's Euros? Well, there are some reasons to be apprehensive. Firstly, among the central midfielders that Gareth Southgate will likely select from, Mainoo is one of the smallest. That's somewhat forgivable, considering Mainoo is generally successful in his ground duels, but the 19-year-old is still susceptible to getting out-muscled. There's a recent example of that against Crystal Palace, where Jean-Philippe Mateta is receiving a pass and Mainoo looks to put him under pressure, but he bounces off the Frenchman, allowing Palace to run straight at United's defence. This could be an issue for Southgate's England, because over the last 2 major tournaments, he's consistently selected midfielders who are dominant in their defensive duels, making England harder to break down when they retreat into their defensive block. For example, during the Euros in 2021, Calvin Phillips and Declan Rice sat deep both in and out of possession, protecting a defence that conceded 2 goals all tournament. And during the World Cup in 2022, Jordan Henderson and Jude Bellingham aided Rice in a midfield 3, which is a setup England have used ever since. That's not to say there isn't a spot here for Mainoo though. Henderson's place is far less secure than it was 2 years ago, and in this 3-man midfield, Bellingham and Rice's physicality can help accommodate for Mainoo's deficiencies. However, Mainoo could be left left more isolated when England press high up the pitch, which since the last Euros is something that Southgate's side has done on a more frequent basis. In fairness, Mainoo has demonstrated good out-of-possession traits this season, particularly when it comes to quickly closing down opposition players in the final third. However, it's hard to gauge just how good his defensive qualities are, given Manchester United have been so poor as a defensive unit this season. So his physicality and the form of his club may leave Southgate with more questions than answers. Like, will Mainoo be able to defend at a higher standard alongside Bellingham and Rice? Or will any bad habits he's picked up at United leave England exposed? Of course, we'll likely have clearer answers to those questions when Mainoo has more experience under his belt. But Southgate's primary concern will be if he makes England a better team right now. Fortunately for Mainoo, what he brings on the ball may offset any off-the-ball concerns. Because as Southgate's side has become more possession dominant, holding nearly 60% of the ball against France and Qatar compared to 44% against Croatia 4 years earlier, the midfielders have pushed further forward during build-up, deeper into the opposition's defensive block. Here they can pull defenders out of position, creating space for someone else to exploit, or receive the ball, evade their marker, and carry into the space themselves. However, the players who can do this most effectively for England, such as Mason Mount or James Maddison, may be too attack-minded to balance out Jude Bellingham on the other side, who appears to be a guaranteed starter for England. This is perhaps why, when England have faced teams like Italy or France, Southgate has opted for more defensive midfielders, favouring Phillips, Henderson, or Conor Gallagher. Yet none of these players can play the role as effectively as England's more attacking players, with all three preferring to receive the ball facing the goal, placing pressure on Bellingham to drop deeper to provide a passing option, making England's build-up slower and easier to contain. This is where Mainoo could slot in perfectly. He's more defensively minded than England's attacking midfielders, but much more comfortable under pressure than the likes of Henderson, Phillips and Gallagher. As pointed out by The Athletic's Carl Anker, Mainoo's shining qualities this season have been his composure, his close control and his ability to move the ball forwards. And not only has he shown this for Man United, but he also quickly demonstrated his value when given the opportunity in an England shirt. First against Brazil, where he received the ball, turned his marker and carried it into space just minutes after coming on, and then against Belgium on his first start, receiving deep inside the block, turning and quickly passing it forwards. This left a strong impression on Southgate, who acknowledged that while his side were a little more open with Mainoo in it, the benefits on the ball were clear to see. So while there may be concerns over how well Mainoo can fit in defensively, even Southgate himself recognises the quality that he can bring. Which, considering that the other midfield options are either too defensive or too attacking to be truly effective in this role, the case is strong for Mainoo to start in England's midfield this summer. Perhaps showing that Southgate isn't as risk-averse as many people think.
Thank you, Alex Barker. JPB, what do you think? Could he start?
I think he could start. I think there's a big question mark, and that is, who is the third midfielder? Because look, Declan Rice is definitely going to start. Jude Bellingham is definitely going to start.
Oh, that's a
and they're
fine
really,
midfield.
really good players. But alongside them, we don't really know. Like, Jordan Henderson has had a difficult season. Calvin Phillips has had a difficult season. There's not a very obvious, Mason Mount's barely played for Manchester United.
Yeah.
There's not a...
Wayne Rooney's doing work to get his name involved.
Yeah, I mean, there is not a very obvious standout candidate. I think it probably will be too soon for Mainoo to go straight in a Euros, but I right now I think this is the biggest single question. My guess is it will be Conor Gallagher, who has had a pretty good season at Chelsea. But there's not a lot of candidates.
No, okay. Well, I mean, one of the upsides, as we said, of Southgate, hypothetically taking this job at Manchester United would be potentially working with these younger players. But there's one other thing as well, one missing piece that you've alluded to already, JJ, and that is Dan Ashworth. So again, before we talk to JPB, let's hear from Mr. David Ornstein about the latest on the Ashworth news.
So Dan Ashworth remains on gardening leave. That's because Manchester United are yet to reach an agreement with Newcastle United over compensation for him to switch between the clubs as sporting director. I recently revealed that Ashworth, with the support of Man United, is taking Newcastle to arbitration in a bid to help facilitate his move to Old Trafford. Unless they can find a compromise in advance, that legal process should finally produce some clarity over when Ashworth can start his new role. But for now, we have no date and therefore no clarity on whether he'll be able to work for Man United in this summer's transfer window. It may be influenced by Newcastle's appointment of Ashworth's replacement, which itself is also not yet done.
All right, that was the Ashworth news. What do you think there, JPB? Who is this guy, and what does he mean to me?
So Dan Ashworth was FA Head of Elite Development, and he was in charge in building a better pathway for young English players so that they could come into the England team with a bit more experience of winning things. And this was a huge success. This is things like introducing under-15s. It's like changing the tournaments that England youth teams went to. It's about having a sort of standardised style of play through the entire England youth system. And this led to outcomes like England winning the under-17 World Cup with the team with like Foden and Sancho and those guys in. It's to do with like bringing through Bellingham. And so all these fantastic young players that are coming through at the moment. And of course, EPP's part of this too. But a lot of it is down to how Dan Ashworth reorganised how England youth teams did. And he did so much this work joint with Gareth Southgate, arm in arm with Southgate, who was England under-21s manager, of course, before he was a seniors manager. So that relationship has already, been a really good working relationship in the past, and I think that's why a lot of people wonder whether it might be a good working relationship again in the future.
Surely that's a tick in the pro column then, for this hypothetical argument.
Well, it's a tick in the column of Southgate and Ashworth have a really good working relationship, which has borne fruit in the past.
That's my favourite column.
Yeah. I start every bit of paper with that written at the top. It's a really good working relationship. Dan Ashworth has done really well wherever he's gone in his career. I think he'll be a very successful appointment for Manchester United. And I think that's led a lot of people to wonder whether or not the two might work together. I still think that insofar as there's a kind of question mark over whether like Southgate's suitability for the Manchester United job, it's, can he make that step from international football to club football? Because not a lot of people do it. Like how many examples can you think of in the last few years? Hansi Flick did pretty well, won the Champions League, obviously, first time of asking. You can't even count Antonio Conte going from Italy to Chelsea because he'd obviously proved himself at Juventus before he took the Italy job. So there's just not that many case studies that you can fall back on to see if people can make that transition.
Well, listen, John, there is one other manager this week who's been, there are several more who've been linked over time. Not really sure where to look. But this week there was another manager linked in a report released by The Telegraph, and that's Thomas Frank. How does he compare to Southgate? And do you think he would be the better option, the worse option?
I think in many respects, Thomas Frank is the kind of manager that people think Southgate would be if he was at Manchester United, in that you talked before about, yes men, someone who's going to be a company man, who's going to go to the club and essentially do what he's told and not cause any problems from that level. And I think for me that makes a lot more sense, because it then indicates that a lot of the problems we're talking about that need to be solved at Manchester United in terms of the culture, the ownership themselves see themselves as being the ones responsible to fix that, rather than saying, well, let's get Gareth Southgate in and get him to fix it all. And I think part of the way that they would be able to do that then is if you bring in someone like Thomas Frank and you say he's used to working at a club like Brentford where they've got a lot of the culture stuff set out. We can give him players without him necessarily pushing back against it, so we can start developing the squad in a way that we want to do it. He'll largely just not push against the walls when it comes to any of these sorts of decisions. So for me, it seems to make a bit more sense than maybe the Southgate one, because what it's doing then is putting the responsibility in the hands of the owners to fix the underlying issues. Manchester United have tried to solve problems with managers before, and in many respects, the reason why this problem exists in the first place is because Alex Ferguson controlled everything before he left, and so there's always kind of been that void where the expectation is that the manager should be controlling everything, and I think the option that Manchester United now have is to try and fix it through the board and say, okay, well, we'll get in a manager who's going to just be another piece in that holistic puzzle that we talked about before.
But I think the whole point of getting in Omar Barada, Dan Ashworth, Jason Wilcox is to build a club structure in which the role of the manager is in fact quite demarcated. Like
they want a head coach. They've said,
exactly, yeah. There's no point in bringing in those people unless you're going to be incredibly specific about what this one guy does. And so actually in that context, I think Thomas Frank makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And Gareth Southgate doesn't, right? I've never thought about Gareth Southgate as a head coach.
I can kind of buy that argument because Thomas Frank's like know-how is so specified in the sense that he's done a few years in the Premier League. He has that Premier League experience. I actually think when I first heard it, I thought, Thomas Frank at Man United? But the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. Like, he's incredible, from a media perspective, incredibly smart guy, very charismatic, very funny. I think he'd be good at that stuff. I know some people will say, oh, but, Brentford's football is pretty functional. It's not really the Man United way. But at the moment, Manchester United's football is so unfunctional that I actually think functional would be a really good place for them to start. If Thomas Frank can get them to functional, then I actually think that would be a big step forward, and then they can worry about what comes next afterwards.
Well, on the question of Gareth Southgate, to finish here, does it make sense, John? Yes or no?
I think it's just too risky. I buy the arguments that a lot of the change that needs to be effected at Manchester United is off the pitch, but I still think that the on-pitch stuff matters. I'm not sure if Southgate would have the ability to move that needle, and I think at the end of the day, Manchester United fans expect results, and that's been what's made the culture maybe a bit more toxic there. So I think a big part of it would have to be fixing the what's going on the field. And I think, as we said before, the way that the club the owners have decided to do that is by bringing in the infrastructure behind the scenes then to sort that out, and then taking the pressure off the manager and just allowing him to do or her to do the coaching on the field and sorting that aspect out.
JPB?
Yeah, I really admire the idea of it. I think if it were to happen, it would be a very bold and brave move. I think there's some aspects of the job that he would be absolutely perfect for, as he's proven his time in England. I just wonder about that leap. I think that leap from international football to Premier League football is now very big, much bigger than it's been before, and I think that will be the question that people have.
Two erring on the side of no.
I think Erik ten Hag's doing a really good job, and we shouldn't be talking about him losing his job when he hasn't lost it yet.
Right, yeah, okay. Well, just before we finish, let's get some final news from David Ornstein.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and Rafa Honigstein. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.